Wyoming Territory, 1872. The silence out here had a weight to it. Elias Thorne felt it most mornings, sitting on the top rail of his corral fence with a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket woven from dust, distance, and the ghosts of things left unsaid. It pressed down on the vast, sage-dotted plains that rolled away from his ranch in every direction, a landscape of brutal beauty painted in shades of ochre, gray, and the pale, unforgiving blue of the sky. For 5 years, this silence had been his only constant companion, his sanctuary, and his penance. He had built this life with his own 2 hands, carving it from a wilderness that was indifferent to a man's sorrows. The log house stood sturdy against the wind, its timbers silvered by the sun. The barn was solid, the fences were straight, and his cattle were healthy. It was an ordered world, a fortress of routine designed to keep the chaos of memory at bay. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had lost everything, that survival was a solitary endeavor. Attachments were vulnerabilities, cracks in the armor through which pain could seep. Love was a warmth he remembered like a phantom lamb, a feeling he no longer trusted himself to hold. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark speck riding the thermal currents. Elias tracked its lazy spiral, his gaze sharp and distant. He knew every dip and rise of this land, every draw where snow lingered late into the spring, every rocky outcrop where a cougar might watch his herd. This knowledge was his strength, his connection to something real and tangible in a world that had once shattered like glass against stone. The past was a closed room, the door bolted from the inside. He had no intention of ever opening it again. His wife, Mary, and their son, little Sam, lived there in the quiet dust of his memory, and that was where they would stay. He took a slow sip of the lukewarm coffee. The bitterness was familiar, grounding. His housekeeper, Martha, a widow whose pragmatism was as unyielding as the granite hills, would be clattering pans in the kitchen by now. She was the one exception to his rule of solitude, a necessary presence who managed the house with grim efficiency and rarely ventured into the territory of his thoughts. Their arrangement was one of mutual, unspoken respect for boundaries. Then the sound came. It was faint at first, a low, mournful cry carried on the wind from the east. The weekly train. It was a sound that always felt like an intrusion, a mechanical scream tearing through the fabric of his quiet world. It meant people, noise, the messy complications of life he had deliberately forsaken. It also meant he was nearly out of flour and coffee, a practical problem that could not be ignored. He drained the last of his coffee, the grounds gritty on his tongue, and slid down from the fence. The dust puffed up around his worn leather boots. He moved with an economy of motion, a man entirely at home in his own skin, yet profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of sharing that space with anyone else. The train was a disruption, and as he saddled his steady gelding, Shadow, a knot of unease tightened in his gut. He told himself it was just the tedious necessity of going into Redemption Gulch, a town that was little more than a single dusty street clinging precariously to the edge of civilization. But some deeper instinct, a whisper from a part of him he thought long dead, warned that this train was different. It was carrying more than just mail and supplies. It was carrying a change he was not prepared for. The train shrieked to a halt, a great iron beast sighing steam into the dry air of Redemption Gulch. The platform was a chaotic swirl of humanity, ranch hands collecting supplies, a few stern-faced women herding children, prospectors whose eyes held the manic glint of gold fever. Elias tied Shadow to the hitching post in front of the general store, his movements deliberate, his expression impassive. He preferred to wait until the initial chaos subsided before conducting his business. He leaned against the support post, his hat pulled low, becoming just another shadow in the harsh midday sun. And then he saw her. She descended from the passenger car like a figure from another world. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, of fine blue wool that was utterly impractical for this dusty, windswept land. It was travel-worn, the hem grayed with soot and dust, but it spoke of refinement, of manicured lawns and gaslit city streets. A matching hat, adorned with a ribbon that had seen better days, was perched atop a cascade of honey-blonde hair that seemed to capture and hold the sunlight. She moved with a delicate grace that was entirely out of place, her gloved hands clutching a small, tapestry-covered valise as if it were a shield. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, scanned the crowd with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She was looking for someone, her expression a fragile mask of composure over a growing unease. Elias watched, a detached observer, as the crowd thinned and the station master began unloading freight. One by one, passengers were greeted, whisked away in buckboards or on horseback, until she was the only one left standing on the platform. The hope in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by the stark, lonely vulnerability of someone who has arrived at the end of the world to find no one waiting. The station master, a hairy man named Jeb, approached her. Elias could not hear their words, but he could read the story in their gestures. Her polite inquiry, his shrug of ignorance, the slow, sinking realization on her face. She was stranded. A familiar, bitter pity stirred in him, an emotion he immediately suppressed. It was not his concern. He had his own ghost to manage. He had no room for the troubles of a stranger, especially one who looked as fragile as a porcelain doll. He turned his attention to the general store, determined to ignore her plight. But the world had other plans. A freight wagon, overloaded with barrels, rumbled down the street. The driver, a burly man Elias recognized as one of the hands from the Miller Ranch, was struggling with his team. A stray dog darted out in front of the lead horse, which shied violently, its eyes rolling in panic. The wagon lurched, the driver shouted, and one of the heavy barrels broke free from its ropes. It tumbled from the wagon bed, hit the ground with a deafening crack, and began to roll directly toward the platform, directly toward the woman in blue. She stood frozen, her face a pale oval of shock. Time seemed to slow, the dust swirling like golden phantoms in the air. Elias did not think. He moved. Years of reacting to charging cattle and unpredictable nature took over. In 3 long strides, he was off the boardwalk and closing the distance. He reached her an instant before the barrel would have, his arm wrapping around her waist, his body a solid wall between her and the danger. He pulled her back hard against his chest. They stumbled together, a tangle of limbs and startled breaths. Her back was flush against him, and he could feel the frantic, bird-like beat of her heart through the layers of her dress and his shirt. She was lighter than he expected, yet she felt impossibly solid in his arms. The scent of lavender and something else, something clean and vaguely floral like a distant memory of spring, filled his senses, a stark contrast to the familiar dust and leather of his own world. The barrel crashed into the platform support where she had been standing, splintering the wood with a sickening crunch. For a moment, they remained locked together. Her gloved hand came up to grip his forearm, her knuckles white. He could feel the fine tremor running through her. He looked down and saw the top of her hat, the stray wisps of golden hair that had escaped their pins. The world rushed back in. The shouting of the driver, the worried murmurs of onlookers. The intimacy of the moment was sudden and jarring. It was the closest he had been to another person, to a woman, in 5 long years. He released her as if she were a hot coal. He stepped back, putting a careful distance between them, the phantom warmth of her body already a searing brand on his senses. "You should watch where you stand, ma'am," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, the words a clumsy shield for the turmoil inside him. She turned to face him, her green eyes wide with shock and a dawning gratitude. Her cheeks were flushed, a delicate pink against the pallor of her skin. She smoothed the front of her dress with a trembling hand, her composure rattled, but not entirely broken. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice clear and educated, a melody starkly different from the rough tones of the territory. You saved me." Elias simply nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to walk away, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude, but her gaze held him. It was direct and intelligent, and in its depths he saw not just fear, but a flicker of profound disappointment, a deep well of sorrow that resonated with his own. He recognized the look of someone whose foundations had crumbled beneath them, and against every instinct he possessed, he found himself unable to turn his back. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose silver badge was tarnished with age and duty, had seen the whole affair from his office window. He ambled over, his gait slow and deliberate. "Everything all right here, Elias?" "Mung." The woman, Clara May Thompson, as she introduced herself, explained her situation to the sheriff in a voice that trembled only slightly. She had come from Philadelphia to take a position as a governess for the children of a Mr. Blackwood, a man she knew only through correspondence arranged by a distant cousin. The address he had given her was for a ranch several miles north of town. But Mr. Blackwood had not appeared, and when Sheriff Brody heard the name, his expression soured. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice gentle but firm, "there is no Blackwood ranch north of here. And the man who owns that parcel of land, Silas Croft, is a bachelor of 70 years. He has no children." He exchanged a grim look with Elias over her head. They both knew the kind of men who lured unsuspecting women out to the territory with false promises. The last vestiges of color drained from Clara's face. The carefully constructed wall of her composure finally crumbled, leaving behind a stark and terrible vulnerability. She swayed on her feet, and for a second, Elias thought she might faint. His hand twitched, an involuntary impulse to reach out to steady her. He clenched it into a fist at his side. "I don't understand," she whispered, her gaze unfocused, fixed on some terrible interior landscape. "My ticket was paid for. The letter, it seems so genuine. I have only a few dollars to my name. I sold nearly everything I own to make the journey." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is a bad business, Miss Thompson. A bad business indeed." He looked around the dusty street, his gaze assessing the limited options. The town's only hotel was little more than a saloon with a few grimy rooms upstairs, no place for a respectable woman alone. It was Martha, Elias's housekeeper, who provided the unwelcome solution. She had come into town for thread and had witnessed the entire scene with her sharp, bird-like eyes. She marched over, her face set in its usual lines of disapproval, though her gaze on Clara was softer than Elias had ever seen it. "Sheriff," she said, her voice brooking no argument, "the girl can't stay at the saloon. It ain't decent." She looked directly at Elias, her eyes pinning him in place. "We have a spare room. It's clean. She can stay with us until she figures her next move. I'll be there to see to propriety." A cold dread washed over Elias. His ranch, his sanctuary, invaded. He opened his mouth to protest, to list a dozen reasons why it was impossible, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Clara Thompson, at the raw despair in her wide green eyes, and saw a reflection of the same desolation he had felt standing over two fresh graves 5 years ago. He saw the terrifying abyss of being utterly and completely alone. The protest lodged in his chest, a hard, painful lump. "It would only be for a day or two," the sheriff added, his tone reasonable but with an underlying current of command. "Just until we can get this sorted out, maybe arrange passage for her back east on the next train." Elias felt trapped. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his answer. To refuse would be an act of cruelty so profound it would brand him an outcast even in this land of hard men. His code of honor, buried deep beneath layers of grief and isolation, would not allow it. He gave a short, sharp nod, the motion stiff and resentful. "Fine," he bit out. "A few days. Martha will show you the way." He turned without another word and strode into the general store, the bell above the door jangling angrily. He could feel her eyes on his back, a silent weight of gratitude and confusion. Inside, surrounded by the familiar scents of canvas, coffee, and cured tobacco, he gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles were white. The silence of his world had been broken, and a woman with eyes the color of a spring meadow and the scent of lavender was about to walk directly into the heart of it. He felt like a man watching a storm build on the horizon, knowing it was too late to seek shelter. The journey to the ranch was a study in strained silence. Clara sat beside Martha on the wagon seat, her back ramrod straight, while Elias rode ahead on shadow. He kept a deliberate distance, his broad shoulders a rigid wall of rejection. He did not look back, not once, but he was aware of her with every fiber of his being. He could feel her presence like a change in the air pressure before a storm. The familiar landscape, usually a source of comfort, now felt charged with a strange, unsettling energy. When they arrived, the ranch house seemed to shrink under her gaze. To him, it was a fortress. He suddenly saw it through her eyes, a rough-hewn, lonely outpost at the edge of nowhere. It was stark and masculine, filled with functional furniture he had made himself. The walls bare except for a rifle rack and a faded photograph on the mantelpiece he could never bring himself to put away. Martha, true to her word, took charge. "This will be your room," she announced, leading Clara to the small, clean space at the back of the house. It was sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the endless plains. "It's not much, but the bed is soft. Supper is at sundown." With that, she left, leaving Clara standing alone in the middle of the room, her small valise at her feet. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress springs groaning in protest. The silence here was different from the silence of the city. It was deeper, more profound, filled with the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a bird. It felt less like an absence of noise and more like a living thing. She pressed her hands to her face, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She had been so hopeful, so certain that this was a new beginning. Now, she was a charity case, taken in by a man whose eyes were as cold and gray as a winter sky. A man who had saved her life and clearly regretted it. She spent the afternoon trying to make herself useful, an instinct born of a lifetime of believing one must earn their keep. She offered to help Martha in the kitchen, but the older woman, while not unkind, was a territorial creature who preferred to work alone. Clara found a broom and swept the front porch, a futile gesture against the constant encroachment of dust, but it was something to do, an act of defiance against the helplessness that threatened to consume her. Elias watched her from the barn, where he was mending a harness. He saw the determined set of her jaw as she wielded the broom, the way she paused to look out at the vast, intimidating landscape, her shoulders slumping for a moment before she squared them again. He saw resilience where he had expected fragility. It was irritating. It made her harder to dismiss, harder to categorize as a problem that would soon be gone. He pulled the leather stitch tighter than necessary, the awl digging into his calloused palm. Supper was a tense affair. The three of them sat at the heavy plank table in the main room. The air was thick with unspoken words. Elias ate with a focused intensity, his gaze fixed on his plate. Martha, sensing the chasm of silence, made a few attempts at conversation, asking Clara about Philadelphia. Clara answered politely, her voice soft, but the effort was visible. "It is very different from this," Clara said, gesturing vaguely at the window, now a dark square reflecting the lamplight. "There are buildings so tall they seem to touch the clouds, and the streets are always full of people, day and night." "Sounds loud," Elias grunted, not looking up from his stew. It was not a question, but a judgment. "It can be," she conceded, "but there's an energy to it, a feeling that anything is possible." Her voice trailed off, the statement ending on a melancholic note, an echo of a belief she no longer held. After the meal, Martha declared she was turning in, leaving Elias and Clara alone in the main room. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. It was the only sound in the room. Clara felt an overwhelming urge to flee to the safety of her small bedroom, but some stubborn part of her refused to be intimidated. She was a guest in his home, however reluctantly, and she would behave with grace. She noticed it then, sitting on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the fire. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint faded and worn smooth in places from the touch of small hands. It was a simple, childish thing, yet it was displayed with a quiet reverence that seemed at odds with the stark functionality of the rest of the room. "That's a beautiful carving," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the silence. Elias looked up, his gaze following hers to the mantel. A shuddered expression fell over his face, a mask of pain so profound it was almost physical. For a long moment, he said nothing. He stared into the fire, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles white. Clara instantly regretted speaking, certain she had trespassed on some sacred ground. "I'm sorry," she began. "I didn't mean to." "My son carved it," he said, his voice low and raspy, as if the words were being dredged up from a deep, dry well. "His name was Sam. He was 6-inch. The simple, declarative statements landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. This was the source of the coldness in his eyes, the deep, abiding sorrow that clung to him like a shroud. He did not look at her, but he kept talking, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if he were seeing something else entirely. There was a fever that winter. It took him and his mother, Mary, within a week of each other. There was nothing I could do. Nothing. The last word was barely a whisper, freighted with 5 years of guilt and helplessness. In that moment, he was no longer the intimidating, cold-hearted rancher. He was a man hollowed out by grief. Clara's own losses, the recent deaths of her parents that had left her adrift and vulnerable, felt both smaller and yet deeply connected to his. She understood, in a way she hadn't moments before, the fortress he had built around himself. It was not made of anger, but of pain. "I lost my parents last year," she found herself saying, the words coming out in a quiet rush. "My father's heart, and then my mother. She just seemed to fade away without him. That's why I came west. There was nothing left for me there. No one, I thought." She stopped, unable to voice the foolishness of her hopes. He finally turned his head and looked at her. For the first time, the gray of his eyes was not cold, but clear, like a winter sky after a storm has passed. He saw not a fragile Eastern lady, but a woman who understood the language of loss. A flicker of something, recognition, empathy, a shared humanity, passed between them. It was not a bridge, but the first stone laid for one, a fragile connection in the vast wilderness of their shared loneliness. "The world doesn't care much for what we think," he said, the statement a bleak summary of his philosophy. "Perhaps," she countered softly, her gaze unwavering. "But we are still here. We have to care." He had no answer for that. He simply looked at her, at the firelight catching the gold in her hair, and felt the first, terrifying crack in the wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart. The silence that returned to the room was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared truths. The days that followed fell into a strange, hesitant rhythm. Clara, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping. She learned to feed the chickens, her fine wool dress exchanged for a simple calico one Martha had found for her. She tended the small vegetable garden behind the house, her soft hands becoming chapped and calloused. She was clumsy at first, a creature of the city struggling with the practical demands of the land, but she was a quick study, and her resolve never wavered. Elias watched her from a distance. He found himself cataloging the small details of her presence, the way she hummed softly to herself as she worked, the focused frown on her face as she tried to churn butter, the surprising strength in her slender frame as she carried buckets of water from the well. Each observation was a small chip in his armor. He was annoyed by the intrusion, yet he found his eyes drawn to her constantly. The ranch, once a silent monument to his loss, was slowly filling with the quiet sounds of her life. He taught her to handle a horse, his instructions terse and practical. He lifted her into the saddle of a gentle mare, his hands spanning her waist for a brief, electric moment. He felt her sharp intake of breath, saw the flush rise on her cheeks, and retreated as quickly as he could, his own heart hammering against his ribs with a foreign, unwelcome rhythm. He walked beside her, his hand on the bridle, the scent of lavender clinging to her despite the dust and the sun. "You have to show the horse you're in charge," he said, his voice gruffer than necessary, but with a gentle hand. "They sense fear." "I am not afraid," she replied, her chin held high, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. And she was not. She was cautious, but not fearful. He was beginning to realize that the fragility he had first perceived was merely a thin veneer of refinement over a core of solid steel. Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch a few days later, his face grim. "Some fellas were in town," he told Elias, keeping his voice low so Clara, who was mending a shirt on the porch, could not overhear. "Two of them, hard-looking types. They were asking questions at the saloon, asking about a young woman, honey blonde, who came in on the last train." A cold knot formed in Elias's stomach. "Blackwood, has to be," Brody confirmed. "Sounds to me like he didn't just lure her out here on a whim. He wants her for something. And he's not the type to give up easy." The sheriff looked over at Clara, his expression softening. "You be careful, Elias. That woman is under your protection. The man who would do this to her is capable of anything." The sheriff's warning settled over the ranch like a shroud. The peace of the last few days was shattered, replaced by a tense, watchful vigilance. Elias started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The wilderness that had been his sanctuary now felt menacing, its vast emptiness a place where danger could hide. His protective instincts, dormant for so long, roared to life, but they were tangled with a new, confusing emotion. His concern for Clara was more than just a sense of duty. It was personal, sharp, and terrifying. The thought of any harm coming to her sent a bolt of cold fury through him. He found himself engineering reasons to keep her close to the house, his manner becoming more curt and commanding, a clumsy attempt to mask his fear. Clara felt the change in him immediately. The tentative warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by the familiar, cold distance. He was watching her, but not with the grudging respect of before. Now his gaze was hard, assessing, as if she were a liability. It hurt more than she cared to admit. She believed he was growing tired of her presence, that the burden of her situation had finally become too much. One afternoon, seeking a few moments of solitude, she wandered further from the house than she intended, following a small creek that wound its way through a stand of cottonwood trees. The cool shade was a relief from the relentless sun, the sound of the gurgling water a soothing balm. She sat on a sun-warmed rock, trailing her fingers in the water, lost in thought. She was trying to devise a plan, any plan that would allow her to leave the Thorn Ranch without appearing ungrateful. She could try to find work in town, perhaps as a seamstress or a laundress. It would be a hard life, but it would be her own. She did not hear them approach. One moment she was alone, and the next, two men were standing on the opposite bank of the creek. They were rough, unkempt men with cruel eyes and the predatory stillness of wolves. One of them, a thick-set man with a scar that twisted his lip into a permanent sneer, grinned at her. "Well, now look what we have here," he said, his voice a low, greasy drawl. "Lost, little lady." Clara's heart leaped in her throat. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. These were the men from the sheriff's description. She knew it with a sickening certainty. "I am not lost," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I am on the Thorn Ranch." The second man, taller and thinner, chuckled. "We know where you are, Missy. Mr. Blackwood sent us. He's real eager to make your acquaintance. He's got some papers for you to sign. Just a little formality." "I have no business with any Mr. Blackwood," she said, taking a step back. "You need to leave. You are trespassing." The scarred man splashed across the shallow creek, his boots sending up sprays of water. "I don't think you're in a position to be giving orders." He reached for her arm. "You're coming with us. The easy way or the hard way. It's all the same to Blackwood." Clara cried out and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She opened her mouth to scream, but a shot rang out, the crack of a rifle echoing through the cottonwoods. The bullet slammed into the dirt at the man's feet, kicking up a spray of mud and pebbles. He froze, his hand dropping from her arm as he whirled around. Elias stood at the edge of the trees, his rifle resting easily in his hands, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been tracking a stray calf and had seen the men's horses tied carelessly in the open. "That's far enough," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "She told you to leave. This is your only warning." The second man, still on the other side of the creek, had his hand on the pistol at his hip. "This ain't your concern, rancher. We got business with the lady. She is on my land," Elias stated, his gaze never leaving the man who had touched Clara. "That makes her my concern. Now you get on your horses and you ride out. If I see either of you on my property again, I won't aim for the ground." There was a long, tense moment where the only sound was the creak and the hammering of Clara's heart. The men exchanged a look. They were armed, but Elias had the advantage of surprise and position. More than that, there was a look in his eyes, a chilling, absolute certainty, that told them he was not making an idle threat. The scarred man spat on the ground, his eyes full of venom, and then backed away slowly, splashing back across the creek. Without another word, the two of them turned and disappeared into the trees. A moment later, she heard the sound of their horses galloping away. Clara stood trembling, her arms wrapped around herself. The world seemed to tilt and sway. Elias was suddenly there, in front of her, his rifle now held loosely in one hand. His eyes swept over her, checking for injury, his expression unreadable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. She shook her head, unable to speak. A wave of delayed shock washed over her, and her knees buckled. He caught her, his arm going around her waist to steady her, pulling her against him. This time, he did not let go. He held her for a moment as she fought for breath, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart, a comforting rhythm in the chaotic aftermath of her fear. He held her until the trembling subsided, his hand a warm, heavy weight on her back. The protective gesture was so at odds with his usual distance that it left her reeling. When he finally set her gently away from him, the look on his face was not one of relief or anger, but of a deep, profound fear. It was the look of a man who had come too close to losing something he hadn't even admitted to himself that he valued. The aftermath of the confrontation was worse than the event itself. Elias's fear, raw and potent, did not soften him. It hardened him. The near loss of Clara had triggered his deepest trauma, resurrecting the ghost of his own helplessness. He saw not a victory in running off Blackwoodsmen, but a prelude to a tragedy he was doomed to repeat. He had let someone into his world, and now danger had followed. In his mind, the logic was brutal and inescapable. His presence, his protection, was the very thing that was putting her in harm's way. He retreated into a silence so complete and cold it was like a physical wall. He avoided her, his gaze sliding past her as if she were a ghost. The brief, fragile connection they had forged by the fireside, the shared vulnerability that had felt so real, was gone, buried under an avalanche of his fear. He saw only one solution, one way to keep her safe, and that was to send her away. He had to sever the tie before it could be forcibly cut by violence and leave him with another loss he knew he could not survive. He cornered her in the kitchen 2 days later. Martha was out in the garden, and the house was quiet. Clara was kneading bread, her hands covered in flour, a task she had taken to with surprising aptitude. She looked up as he entered, a hopeful, hesitant smile on her face that died when she saw his expression. It was closed off, his jaw set like granite. "The stagecoach passes through Redemption Gulch on Friday," he said without preamble, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I'm taking you into town. I'll buy your ticket back to Philadelphia." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her hands frozen in the dough, her heart plummeting. "What?" she whispered, certain she had misheard. "You can't stay here," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point over her shoulder. He could not bring himself to look at her, to see the hurt he knew would be in her eyes. "It's not safe. Those men will be back. As long as you are here, you are a target. You need to go back east, where you belong. Where you belong." The phrase echoed in the quiet kitchen, a cruel affirmation of all her deepest fears. She did not belong here. She was a burden, a danger, an unwanted complication in his solitary life. The kindness he had shown, the protection he had offered, had all been a lie, a temporary duty he was now eager to shed. Her heart, which had so foolishly begun to hope, fractured. "I see," she said, her voice small but infused with a sudden, icy pride. She pulled her hands from the dough and wiped them on her apron, her movements stiff and precise. "You're right, of course. I have imposed on your hospitality for far too long." She would not let him see her cry. She would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his rejection wounded her. "It's not about hospitality," he said, his tone harsh. "It's about keeping you alive." "And what life am I supposed to return to?" she shot back, her control finally snapping. A spark of anger flared in her green eyes. "There is nothing for me in Philadelphia. No home, no family. Did you listen to a word I said the other night? Or were you simply waiting for your turn to speak of your own tragedies?" The accusation hit its mark. He flinched as if she had struck him. "That's not fair," he growled. "Fair?" she asked, her voice rising with a grief that was too large to contain. "Was it fair that I was lured out to this desolate place with lies? Is it fair that my only option is to be sent back in disgrace, with my tail between my legs, because the man who saved my life has decided I am too much trouble to protect?" She took a shaky breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I will not be a burden to you any longer, Mr. Thorne. I will find my own way. I will go into town, and I will find work. I will scrub floors or wash laundry. I will do whatever it takes. But I will not be sent away like a stray dog you have grown tired of." With that, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her back straight, her head held high. Elias stood alone, the scent of yeast and her righteous anger hanging in the air. Her words had cut him to the quick, exposing the selfish core of his fear. He was trying to protect himself, not just her. He was pushing her away not for her safety, but to save himself from the agony of potentially losing her. The realization was a bitter pill. He had become the very thing he despised, a coward, hiding from life behind the walls of his own grief. But the knowledge did not change his resolve. It only deepened his misery. The risk was too great. He had to make her leave. The night before the stagecoach was due was thick with a suffocating tension. A storm was brewing, both outside and within the walls of the ranch house. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind moaned around the eaves like a restless spirit. Supper had been a silent, miserable affair. Martha, sensing the deep rift between them, had retired to her room early, leaving them once again in the charged silence of the main room. Clara sat by the window, staring out into the gathering darkness, her bags packed and waiting in her room. Elias stood by the fire, his back to her, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his knuckles brushing against the small wooden horse. He was a man caught in a trap of his own making, torn between the instinct to pull her close and the desperate, ingrained need to push her away. He was about to speak, to try one last time to make her understand, when a sound from outside cut through the wind. It was the soft nicker of a horse, too close to the house. Elias froze. His head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He exchanged a look with Clara. She had heard it too. The fear was stark on her face. "Get away from the window," he commanded in a low, urgent whisper. He moved silently to the wall, taking the rifle from its rack. He checked the load with practiced efficiency, his movements swift and sure. "They're here." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising shriek of the wind. She backed away from the window, her eyes wide and fixed on Elias. The man who had tried to send her away was gone, replaced by a protector, a warrior. His face was grim, his focus absolute. "Go to your room," he ordered. "Barricade the door. Stay down, away from the walls." "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not hide. What can I do?" He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw not terror, but a fierce, desperate resolve. He did not have time to argue. "The lamps," he said, nodding toward the 2 oil lamps that lit the room. "Put them out." Now, as she hurried to extinguish the lights, plunging the room into near darkness illuminated only by the flickering firelight, the first gunshot shattered the night. The window beside her exploded inward, spraying glass across the floor. Clara cried out, dropping to her knees. Another shot followed, then another, splintering the log wall near Elias's head. "Stay down," he roared, firing his own rifle through the broken window, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The fight had begun. The assault was brutally efficient. Blackwood's men, there sounded to be at least 4 of them, had surrounded the house. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, a relentless barrage designed to pin them down. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Elias moved through the darkened room like a phantom, firing, reloading, changing positions, making himself a difficult target. He was a formidable fighter, his movements economical and deadly, born of a deep familiarity with violence. But he was outnumbered. Clara crawled on her hands and knees to the fireplace, her mind working furiously through the panic. She was not a helpless victim. She would not be. She remembered Elias's word from weeks ago, when he had begrudgingly shown her how to load the spare shotgun he kept behind the door. Her hands fumbled in the dark, her fingers finding the heavy shells on the mantelpiece. With trembling determination, she broke open the gun and fed 2 shells into the breech, the click of the mechanism shockingly loud. A heavy thud sounded against the back door, followed by the crunch of splintering wood. They were trying to break in. Elias fired in that direction, shouting a curse. "The door won't hold. Elias," Clara called out, her voice tight with fear. One of the attackers, a large silhouette against the stormy night, finally smashed through the weakened kitchen door. He stumbled into the room, a pistol in his hand, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom. He saw Clara first, a pale shape huddled by the hearth. A cruel grin split his face as he raised his weapon. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Elias was on the other side of the room, his rifle empty. He roared her name, a sound of pure agony. Clara did not scream. She reacted. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the heaviest weapon she could find, the solid iron poker from the fireplace. As the man took a step toward her, she swung it with all her might, a desperate, 2-handed blow. The poker connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and crumpled to the floor in a heap. The pistol clattered from his limp hand. Clara stood over him, breathing in ragged gasps, the heavy poker clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The momentary silence was broken by a roar of fury from outside. Another man appeared in the shattered doorway, firing wildly into the room. Elias, having reloaded, returned fire. But in the exchange, a stray shot from outside struck one of the remaining oil lamps, which had been knocked to the floor. It shattered, and flames erupted, licking greedily at the dry wooden floorboards and a nearby curtain. "Fire!" Clara screamed, the word torn from her throat. The room was suddenly illuminated by a terrifying orange glow. Smoke began to fill the air, thick and acrid. They were trapped between the fire and the gunmen. The heat was becoming intense, the flames spreading with frightening speed. "We have to get out," Elias yelled, grabbing her arm. "The barn." He dragged her toward the front of the house, away from the growing inferno. He kicked open the front door, and they spilled out into the wild night, the wind and rain lashing at them. Gunshots followed them as they sprinted across the open ground toward the dark shape of the barn. The world was a chaotic nightmare of shouting, gunfire, and the roaring of the flames that were now beginning to consume the house, his home, the repository of all his memories. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the woman whose hand he gripped tightly in his own. The thought of losing her, of seeing her fall, eclipsed every other fear, every past pain. It was a truth so bright and terrible it burned away all his defenses. He shoved her behind a water trough as a bullet whizzed past his ear. He knelt beside her, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the darkness. The burning house cast a hellish light on the scene, silhouetting the remaining attackers who were now moving to cut them off from the barn. In that desperate, stolen moment, with death all around them, he looked at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a fierce, unyielding courage. He saw the woman who had swung an iron poker, the woman who had refused to hide, the woman he loved. The folly of his actions, of trying to push her away, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He had been a fool, a coward, so afraid of repeating the past that he was willing to sacrifice his entire future. "Clara," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was trying to protect you, but I was just protecting myself from feeling again." Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain and the soot. "Elias, I love you," he said, the words a desperate, ragged confession in the heart of the storm. "I think I have from the moment I saw you." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "We're going to get through this. Together." Another shot kicked up dirt beside them. The time for words was over. He looked from the burning house to the dark sanctuary of the barn, then back at her, his grip on her hand tightening. His next words were not just an instruction, but a vow, a promise of a new beginning if they could only survive this night. "Take my hand," he said, his voice a raw command, full of love and desperate hope. "And don't look back." He pulled her to her feet, and they ran. They ran from the flames of the past and the bullets of the present, their hands locked together, a single unit moving through the chaos. They dove through the open barn door just as a volley of shots splintered the wood where they had been. Inside, the darkness was absolute, smelling of hay and horses. Elias slid the heavy bar across the door, sealing them in. The sounds of the battle outside were muffled now, but the roar of the fire was a constant, terrifying reminder of their dwindling time. They could hear the men shouting, regrouping for another assault. Elias guided Clara toward the back of the barn, his hand a firm, reassuring presence on her arm. "There's a loft," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll have a better vantage point from there." They climbed the rough-hewn ladder in the dark, the sounds of their own ragged breathing loud in the enclosed space. From the loft, they could peer through the gaps in the timbers. The entire ranch yard was illuminated by the fire. Their house, the home he had built with Mary, was being devoured by the flames, its walls collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks into the stormy sky. A profound sadness washed over him, but it was a distant, secondary ache. The primary emotion, the one that filled him to the bursting point, was a fierce, desperate need to protect the woman beside him. He saw two figures moving cautiously toward the barn. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired. One of the men cried out and fell. The other scrambled for cover behind the wagon. Now there was only one left. "Where is he?" Clara whispered, her eyes scanning the yard. She held the shotgun, its weight a heavy, unfamiliar burden in her arms. "He'll try to circle around back," Elias predicted. "He'll think we're both watching the front." He pressed the rifle into her hands. "You know how this works. Just point and pull the trigger. Keep your eyes on that wagon. If he shows himself, you shoot." "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. "I'm not letting him burn us out," he said grimly. He pulled the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. The firelight glinted off the steel blade. "I'm going to end this." Before she could protest, he slipped over the edge of the loft, landing silently on the hay-strewn floor below. He moved like a shadow toward the rear of the barn, disappearing into the darkness. Clara was left alone in the loft, the heavy rifle in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but his confession, his declaration of love in the midst of chaos, had forged a new strength within her. She would not let him down. She fixed her gaze on the wagon, her finger resting on the trigger. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling wind. Then she saw movement. A man darted from behind the wagon, making a break for the side of the barn. It was the scarred man from the creek. Clara raised a rifle. The the stock clumsy against her shoulder. She centered the sight on his running form, closed her eyes for a second, and fired. The kick of the rifle slammed her back against the wall, but the shot went true. The man screamed, clutching his leg as he tumbled to the ground. He was wounded, but not out of the fight. He rolled, bringing his pistol up, aiming toward the back of the barn where he presumed the shot had come from. But Elias was already there. He emerged from the shadows behind the man like an avenging spirit, a silent, deadly force. The man never had a chance to fire. Elias disarmed him with a swift, brutal efficiency. The fight was short and one-sided. When it was over, the last of Blackwood's men lay still in the mud. Silence descended, broken only by the storm and the fire. It was over. Elias walked back into the barn, his face grim in the flickering light. He climbed the ladder to the loft where Clara was still huddled, the rifle clutched in her hands. He gently took the weapon from her and set it aside. Then he knelt in front of her and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, the last of her strength giving way to a flood of tears. She sobbed into his chest, her body shaking with reaction and relief. He held her tightly, stroking her hair, murmuring her name over and over. "It's all right, Clara. It's over. You're safe. We're safe." They stayed like that for a long time, huddled together in the hayloft, while the home he had built burned to the ground outside. But as he held her, Elias knew he was not losing his home. He was finding it. Home was not a place made of logs and nails. It was the woman in his arms. She was the foundation, the walls, and the roof. With her, he could rebuild anything. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the fire had burned itself out. The ranch house was a smoldering ruin, a black, skeletal scar on the land. Sheriff Brody and a posse of men from town arrived, drawn by the glow in the sky they had seen from miles away. They found Elias and Clara sitting on the corral fence, wrapped in horse blankets against the morning chill, watching the smoke rise from the ashes. The story came out in clipped, concise sentences from Elias and shaky, but clear, details from Clara. They found the bodies of the attackers and the one survivor, the scarred man Clara had shot, who was more than willing to name Silas Blackwood as the man who had hired them. Blackwood, it turned out, had concocted a scheme to get control of the water rights on the neighboring property. He had forged a land title and needed to produce a fake heir to the original owner. He had lured Clara west with the intention of forcing her to pose as that heir and likely marrying her himself to solidify his claim. When she had ended up with Elias, he had resorted to violence. "He won't be a problem anymore," Sheriff Brody assured them, as his men hauled the whimpering prisoner into a wagon. "We'll see him hang for this." The sheriff looked from the ruins of the house to the two of them, sitting so close together on the fence. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. "Looks like you've got some rebuilding to do, son." "Yes, sir," Elias said, his arm tightening around Clara's shoulders. "We do." After the sheriff and his men had departed, a profound quiet settled over the valley. The air was clean and cold, washed by the rain. Elias and Clara stood before the ashes of his past, the tangible proof of the life he had lost. But he felt no despair. He felt only a quiet, profound sense of peace. He had faced his greatest fear, the violent destruction of his world, and had survived. He had not only survived, he had found a reason to live. He turned to face her. The morning sun caught the gold in her hair, and her green eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, were full of a steady, unwavering light. He took her chapped hands in his. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Well, I said last night, in the middle of all that madness, I meant every word. I was a fool to try and send you away. I was so afraid of losing someone again that I almost lost the best thing that has ever happened to me." "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears. I thought you regretted saving me." "Never," he said fiercely. "Saving you is the first time I felt alive in 5 years." He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring. It was simple, elegant, with a small, intricately carved flower on the band. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me for Mary. But I think it was waiting for you." He knelt, there in the mud and ash, holding the ring up to her. I don't have a house to offer you. I don't have anything but this land and a promise to spend the rest of my days loving you and keeping you safe. Clara Mae Thompson, will you do me the honor of rebuilding this life with me? Will you marry me? A single tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. A radiant smile broke through her exhaustion, a sunrise after the longest night. Yes, she breathed, the word full of all the hope and certainty in the world. Yes, Elias. Of course I will. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood and drew her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness and passion that sealed their promise. The sun rose higher, casting a golden light over the valley, illuminating the ruins of the old life and the sturdy, hopeful foundation of the new one they would build together. The news of Elias Thorne's impending marriage and the rebuilding of his ranch spread through Redemption Gulch like a welcome wildfire. The town, which had long regarded him as a tragic, solitary figure, rallied around the couple with a surprising and heartwarming enthusiasm. They had seen the smoke, heard the tale of the attack, and witnessed the courage of the woman from the east who had stood her ground. Clara was no longer an outsider. She was one of them. Men from neighboring ranches arrived with wagons of fresh-cut timber and strong arms, ready to work. The women of the town, led by a surprisingly sentimental Martha, organized meals for the work crews and collected donations of furniture, linens, and household goods. The shell of a new, larger house began to rise from the ashes of the old one, a testament not to one man's solitary labor, but to the strength of a community. Elias, who had spent years holding himself apart, found himself humbled and deeply moved by the outpouring of support. He worked alongside his neighbors, accepting their help with a quiet gratitude that spoke more than words ever could. He learned to accept a friendly slap on the back, to share a cup of coffee and a moment of conversation. The walls he had built around himself were being dismantled, timber by timber, just as a new home was being constructed. Clara was the heart of it all. She worked tirelessly, directing the placement of windows to catch the morning light, planning a larger kitchen, and sketching out a room that would one day be a nursery. She moved with a newfound confidence, her resilience having blossomed into a quiet, unshakable strength. She had found her place, not just beside Elias, but within this rugged, tight-knit community. She belonged. Their wedding was a simple ceremony, held on the newly laid floor of their half-finished house. The walls were still open to the sky, and the scent of fresh sawn pine filled the air. The entire town attended. Clara wore a simple dress of borrowed cream-colored lace, and in her hair she had woven the wildflowers that grew along the creek. Elias, looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean shirt and jacket, could not take his eyes off her. When the preacher asked him for his vows, Elias turned to Clara, his voice clear and steady for all to hear. I spent a long time believing a man stands strongest when he stands alone. You taught me how wrong I was. My strength, my heart, my home, it's all with you. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to build a life with you that is full of light. When it was her turn, Clara's voice did not waver. I came to this land a stranger, lost and alone. You took my hand and showed me the way home. My home is with you, Elias. Always. They were pronounced man and wife under the vast Wyoming sky, and the cheer that went up from their friends and neighbors echoed across the valley. It was a sound of joy, of new beginnings, of a community celebrating the triumph of love and hope over darkness and despair. That evening, as the sun set, painting the plains in hues of orange and purple, Elias and Clara stood on their porch, hand in hand, looking out at the future they would build together, one day at a time. 2 years later, the silence that settled over the Thorne Ranch at dusk was no longer heavy with loneliness. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the gentle sounds of a life well lived. The chirping of crickets, the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses. From the open door of the new ranch house, light and the warm scent of baking bread spilled out into the twilight. The house itself was a home in every sense of the word. It stood larger and prouder than the one before, with wide windows and a deep porch where two rocking chairs sat side by side. A garden, bursting with flowers and vegetables, flourished under Clara's devoted care. The fences were strong, the barn was full, and the land was thriving. Elias stood on the porch, leaning against a support post, a contented smile on his face. He was a different man from the solitary figure who had once watched the world from a distance. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by the gentle crinkles of laughter. The coldness in his gaze had been thawed by a deep and abiding warmth. He was still quiet, still a man of few words, but his quietness was now one of peace, not of pain. Clara came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. Her belly was round and full beneath her dress, a gentle swell that held the promise of their second child. Their first, a boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's sunny disposition, was sleeping soundly in the small room they had built for him, the one she had sketched out in the ashes. His name was Samuel, a tribute not to a ghost of the past, but to a love that had made the future possible. Inside, on the new mantelpiece, the small, worn wooden horse stood in its place of honor, but was no longer alone. Beside it sat a small, clumsily sewn doll with yarn for hair, a creation of Clara's. They were a pair, a testament to the family that had been lost and the one that had been found. "It's a beautiful evening," Clara said softly, her hand resting on his over her belly. "They're all beautiful with you," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He bent and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of her hair. He had everything he had ever thought was lost to him forever: a wife, a child, another on the way, a home filled with love and laughter. He had learned that attachments were not weaknesses. They were the anchors that held a man steady in the storm. Vulnerability was not a liability. It was the price of a love powerful enough to heal any wound. They stood together in the fading light, watching the first stars appear in the vast, darkening sky. The world was still a wild and unpredictable place, but they faced it together. He was no longer a man alone against the wilderness. He was a husband and a father, his world defined not by loss, but by the boundless love that filled his home. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her even closer. "I love you, Clara Thorne," he whispered into the peaceful twilight. She turned her face up to his, her eyes shining with a love that mirrored his own. "And I love you, Elias," she answered. "Thank you for not looking back."